The night Clifford told him to sleep in the barn, Hector said nothing. He just picked up the old army duffel he'd carried since Fort Bragg, called his dog, and walked across the wet grass without looking back at the house he had helped pay for. Atlas stayed close to his left heel the way he always did, the way Hector had trained him 2 years ago when the VA counselor suggested he get a service animal. The shepherd's shoulder brushed against the side of Hector's leg with every other step, steady as a metronome. And that small pressure was the only thing that felt real right now. The barn smelled like motor oil and old hay. Hector set the duffel on a wooden workbench, sat down on an overturned bucket, and stared at the crack of light coming under the barn door from the porch lamp. Inside the house, through 2 walls and a hallway, he could hear Clifford and Nadine talking. He couldn't make out the words. He didn't need to. He was 67 years old. He had served 22 years in the United States Army, including 2 tours in the Gulf and 1 in Afghanistan. He had driven a Humvee through a burning stretch of highway outside Fallujah and carried a 23-year-old kid named Reyes on his back for 400 meters because the kid's knee was gone and the radio was gone, and the only thing that wasn't gone was Hector's legs. And now his son had put him in a barn. The trouble had started, the way trouble usually does, not with one big thing but with 100 small ones stacked on top of each other, until the pile got too high to see over. When Hector's wife Loretta died 3 years ago, cancer, 14 months from diagnosis to the end. It had been Clifford who stepped in immediately, efficiently, with a clipboard of paperwork and a list of things that needed to be handled. Hector had let him handle them because grief had made him slow, had made the simplest decisions feel like they required more processing power than he had. Who to call about the life insurance, whether to keep the Subaru or sell it, what to do with Loretta's clothes. Clifford handled all of it, and Hector had been grateful. The gratitude had lasted about 8 months. By the time the first winter without Loretta came around, Hector noticed things changing in ways he couldn't quite name. Clifford started dropping by the house more, not to check on Hector, or not only that, he'd walk through the rooms in a way that made Hector think of how buyers tour a house before making an offer. He'd ask questions. What's this worth? When did you get that? The old man who sold you this property, did he leave anything in writing? Hector's house was a 1940s farmhouse on 11 acres outside of Harrodsburg, Kentucky. And it was paid off, and it was his. Loretta had loved the property. She'd planted apple trees along the south fence line that were finally, after 15 years, producing well. Hector wasn't going anywhere, but Clifford's wife Nadine had ambitions, and Nadine had a way of turning Clifford's ambitions in whatever direction she pointed, and she had started pointing at Hector's 11 acres. It started with suggestions. Dad, you don't really need all this space. Dad, the upkeep must be a lot for one person. Dad, have you thought about someplace more manageable? Then it moved to pressure. The doctor says your blood pressure is something to watch. What if something happened and you were alone out here? Then, finally, action. Clifford arrived one Thursday morning with a document from an attorney and asked Hector to sign over power of attorney for his finances and his property. Just as a precaution, he said. Just in case. Hector read the document carefully. He had learned a long time ago to read everything carefully. He set it back on the kitchen table, folded along its original crease, and told Clifford he'd think about it. Clifford left. Nadine called that evening. Her voice had been pleasant and patient in the key that listened and patient when they are running out of patience. That was 6 months ago. Since then, Hector had been staying with Clifford and Nadine while his house underwent some repairs. The roof had needed replacing, and Clifford had offered to manage the contractors, and Hector had agreed to that too, and he was beginning to understand that agreeing to small things had a way of leading you somewhere you hadn't planned to go. The repairs had finished 3 weeks ago. Hector was still here. Every time he mentioned going home, there was a reason it wasn't quite ready. The floors needed sealing. The heat wasn't running right. 1 more week, Dad. He'd been sleeping in Clifford's guest room, which was fine, until Nadine's sister came to visit, and then the guest room became Nadine's sister's room, and Hector became the kind of problem that needed to be relocated. There was a couch, but the couch was too close to the living room, and Clifford liked to watch television late, and so someone, Hector never found out whose idea it specifically was, had suggested the barn. There was a cot out there, they said. It was actually comfortable, they said. Just for a few nights. That had been 4 nights ago. Atlas put his head on Hector's knee. Hector looked down at him. In the dim light coming under the barn door, the shepherd's eyes were dark and calm, watching Hector with that specific attention dogs have, that makes you feel like they're not just looking at you, but seeing into you, past the outside of you, into whatever is actually going on in there. I know, Hector said. Atlas's tail moved once. I know. The letter arrived the next morning, not at the barn, obviously, at the house. Hector only found out about it because he came into the kitchen for coffee, while Clifford and Nadine were still in their robes, and the envelope was sitting on the counter, next to the coffee maker, already opened. A lawyer's letterhead. Hector's name on the front. He picked it up. Clifford started to say something. Hector looked at him once, and Clifford stopped. The letter was from an attorney's office in Lexington, a firm Hector didn't recognize, representing the estate of a man named Theodore Crane. Hector had to read the name twice before it landed. Uncle Teddy. Theodore Crane had been Loretta's uncle, her mother's younger brother, and Hector had met him maybe a dozen times over 35 years of marriage. Teddy was the family oddity. Never married, never lived anywhere for long, worked oil rigs in his 30s and 40s, and then disappeared into the eastern Kentucky hills and built himself some kind of life out there that nobody in the family talked about much. Hector had liked him. Teddy was the kind of man who didn't waste words and didn't ask questions he wasn't genuinely interested in the answers to, which made him unusual at family gatherings and good company, when you could get him alone. The last time Hector had seen him was at Loretta's funeral. Teddy had been somewhere in his 80s by then, moving slowly, but he'd come. He'd stood next to Hector for a while without saying anything, and then he'd said, "She was the best of us, you know." And Hector had nodded, because it was true, and Teddy had squeezed his shoulder once and walked away. Teddy had died in February. The letter was dated March. He had left Hector a piece of property in Breathitt County, an old farmstead about 40 acres, with a structure described in the legal language of the letter as a residential dwelling, single-story, log-frame construction, condition unknown. Clifford laughed, not a mean laugh, almost an involuntary one, like something had caught him off guard. "Breathitt County," he said. "That's deep Appalachia, Dad. What is he even talking about? Some kind of shack in the woods?" Nadine set down her coffee cup. "Is there a value listed?" "There wasn't. It's probably worth nothing," Clifford said. "Those places, you can't even sell them. No road access. Probably no utilities, might not even be structurally." "Thank you," Hector said. He folded the letter, put it back in the envelope, and put the envelope in the front pocket of his shirt. He poured himself a cup of coffee, drank it standing at the counter. Then he went back to the barn, sat on the cot next to Atlas, and read the letter 4 more times. He left on a Tuesday. He didn't make a production of it. He loaded the truck, his truck, a 2009 Ram he'd bought used and maintained meticulously, with what he'd brought to Clifford's, and a few things he'd quietly moved from his own house over the past few days when he'd gone back to check on the floors, the heat, the 1 more weeks. Atlas rode in the passenger seat. He'd built a platform years ago so the dog could look out the window comfortably. Clifford came out to the driveway when he heard the engine. "Where are you going?" "To see what Teddy left me." "Dad, that's 4 hours. Let's at least talk about this. The property is probably... I'll call you when I get there." He didn't call when he got there. He figured he'd call when he had something worth saying. The drive into Breathitt County took him through the kind of landscape that Hector had always found quietly beautiful. The hills rolling up around the road on both sides, the hardwood forests just beginning to come into their late spring color, the creeks that cut under old bridges and disappeared into the trees. The GPS lost confidence somewhere past Jackson and started offering options it didn't seem certain about. Hector pulled over twice to check the map coordinates the attorney had included in a second document. The road turned to gravel about a mile before the property line. He almost missed the gate, a metal farm gate, rusted, padlocked, set between two posts that had been standing long enough to have small trees growing beside them. There was a new padlock alongside the old rusted one, and the attorney's letter had included a key. He opened the gate, drove through, got out and closed it behind him. The lane through the trees was about a quarter mile, and then the trees opened up and Hector stopped the truck. He sat there for a moment, with the engine running, and just looked. The cabin was low and wide, built from the kind of hand-hewn logs you didn't see much anymore. The wood darkened by decades of weather to a deep grayish brown. The roof was metal, older, but from here it didn't look like it was failing. The porch ran the full length of the front, and someone, Teddy, probably years ago, had put in a stone foundation that looked solid. Behind the cabin, through a stand of old oaks, he could see a barn and what might have been a second structure, a shed or a smokehouse. The property sloped down to a creek on the eastern side. The hills came up behind it on the west, close and forested and very green. It wasn't a shack. Atlas was making small sounds in the passenger seat, asking to get out. Hector put the truck in park and opened the door. The inside of the cabin smelled like an old house that had been closed up for a few months. Wood and dust, and the faint ghost of a wood stove. But it was structurally solid. The floors didn't give anywhere. The logs were tight. The main room had a stone fireplace that took up most of the north wall, and there was a kitchen behind it, basic but functional, with a hand pump at the sink that, when Hector worked it for a minute, actually started moving water. There was a well then, a working well. He walked through every room with Atlas at his heel. 2 bedrooms, each with a single window looking out at different angles of the property. A bathroom with a clawfoot tub and a toilet that would need the tank mechanism replaced. A mudroom off the kitchen with hooks along one wall and a boot scraper by the door. On a shelf in the main room, between 2 old books, there was a folded piece of paper with Hector's name on it, in handwriting he didn't recognize. He sat down in a wooden chair by the fireplace and unfolded it. Hector, if you're reading this, I imagine you came, which means you're the man I always thought you were. Loretta talked about you more than you probably know. I want you to have this place because you'll understand what it is. It's not fancy, but it's real, and it's paid for, and nobody can take it from you. There's more here than you can see right now. Let it show you. The dog will help. Teddy Hector read it twice. He folded it carefully and put it in his shirt pocket next to the attorney's letter. He stayed. He'd been there 9 days when Atlas found the door. Hector had been going through the outbuildings. The barn had tools, old but good, and a workbench with a vise that still worked. And he'd come back to the cabin to find Atlas in the back bedroom, sniffing at the edge of the floor, near the baseboard on the south wall. The dog had been at it a while, Hector could tell, because he was doing that focused thing he did when he had decided something was important and wasn't going to leave until someone paid attention. What is it? Atlas pressed his nose against the baseboard. Hector crouched down. The floor was solid here. He'd already checked. But now, looking more closely at where the baseboard met the floor, he could see that the joint was slightly different here than elsewhere in the room. A hair wider. And the floor planks, now that he was looking at them from this angle, were cut in a way that didn't match the rest of the floor. A 3-foot square, the seams barely visible, but there, filled with years of grime that had almost made them disappear. He went to the barn and got a flat pry bar. It took him a while to find the right seam, the right angle. He wasn't trying to force anything. He was looking for how it was meant to open. He'd learned that in the army, before you apply force, make sure you understand the mechanism. He found it eventually. A recessed iron ring folded flat into a groove on one edge of the square. He worked it loose with his fingers, got the ring up, and lifted. A staircase. 7 steps, wooden, going down into a cellar. Atlas was at the top of the stairs before Hector could say anything. The dog went down 3 steps and stopped, looking back. Hector got a flashlight. It was not a treasure, exactly. Not the way that word usually gets used. But what was down there took Hector a long time to fully understand, and by the time he did, he'd been sitting on the bottom step for over an hour with the flashlight dying in his hand. The cellar was dry. Something in how Teddy had built it, or had it built, had kept moisture out for decades. Along 2 walls there were wooden shelves, and on the shelves were tin boxes, old document boxes, the kind people used to use for important papers. Each one was labeled in Teddy's handwriting, with a date range and a category: property records, mineral rights, leases. There was also, in a metal strongbox, with a combination lock, that Teddy had thoughtfully taped the combination to the inside of the cellar door frame, a ledger, and a collection of documents that, when Hector spent the next several evenings reading through them with a battery-powered lantern, turned out to describe something significant. Teddy Crane had, over the course of 30 years, quietly acquired mineral rights to several properties adjacent to and surrounding his own 40 acres. He'd done it the way patient people with no need to impress anyone do things. Slowly, without announcement, buying up small parcels and secondary rights from people who didn't think they were worth much. A lot of them weren't, at the time. A gas company had been in contact with an attorney representing Teddy's estate. The documents in the cellar, transferred properly, would be worth. Hector had to have the attorney explain it to him twice. Somewhere between $400,000 and $600,000 in lease rights alone, with royalty structures that could continue for years. He sat with that number for a long time. Atlas put his head on Hector's knee. "Good boy," Hector said. "Good dog." Clifford called on a Thursday, not to ask how Hector was doing. He'd heard from the attorney's office. Apparently, the estate notifications had gone to multiple family members. Informational copies. Something about Loretta's side of the family, having some connection to the original estate. The details didn't matter. What mattered was that Clifford had heard the word mineral rights, and had driven 4 hours to Breathitt County with Nadine and their attorney, a man named Grover, who wore a suit that cost more than Hector's truck. They arrived while Hector was on the porch drinking coffee. Clifford got out of the car looking like a man who had rehearsed what he was going to say. Nadine stayed by the car. Grover got out with a briefcase. "Dad," Clifford said, "I want you to know we're here because we care about you. This situation, the property, the rights, it's complicated, and you need representation. You need someone who understands." "I have an attorney," Hector said. "Your attorney is a general practice guy in Lexington. This is a mineral rights matter. It's specialized, and there are family interests to consider." "What family interests?" Clifford shifted his weight. "Loretta was Teddy's family, which means we have a connection to this estate. Grover thinks there may be grounds to." "To what?" Grover spoke up then, in the smooth, unhurried way of attorneys who bill by the hour, to contest the bequest on grounds that the decedent's intentions were not Teddy's intentions. Hector said, "Heir in writing. He left me a note. He left me the property. He left me the mineral rights documentation in a cellar. That he sealed himself and left a combination for that he put in a place I would find it." He looked at Clifford. "He knew what he was doing, Dad. You put me in a barn." Silence. "I'm not asking you to feel bad about it," Hector said. "I'm telling you what happened, so we're all starting from the same facts. You put me in a barn, and then you opened a letter addressed to me. And now you've driven 4 hours with an attorney to talk about family interests." He set down his coffee cup on the porch railing. "I think you should go. We're not trying to take anything from you. We're trying to help, Clifford." His voice was level, not angry, just certain. "Go home." Grover made one more effort, something about mediation and reasonable discussions. Atlas stood up from where he'd been lying by Hector's chair. He didn't growl. He just stood up and looked at the 3 of them with that calm, direct attention. They left. The legal process took about 4 months. Clifford and Grover filed a claim. Hector's attorney, he'd found a better one in Lexington. A woman named Sandra Kell, who specialized in estate and property law, and who told him flatly that the claim was a reach, and she'd enjoyed reaching back, handled it. The case didn't go to a full trial. There was a hearing, a judge, some documents presented. The note from Teddy was admitted as evidence. The mineral rights documents, all in order, were admitted as evidence. The combination taped to the inside of the cellar door frame, which Hector photographed the day he found it, was referenced. The judge was not warm about the other side's argument. She asked Grover, at one point, what he believed the legal basis was for contesting a clear bequest from a competent adult to a named individual. Grover said something about family expectations. The judge looked at him the way judges look at attorneys who are wasting the court's time. The claim was denied. Hector shook Sandra Kell's hand on the courthouse steps. He'd put on the sport coat he kept in the truck for occasions that required a sport coat. The morning was cold and clear, early October, the hills around Lexington going orange and red at the edges. "What are you going to do with it?" she asked. He'd been thinking about that for 4 months. He'd been thinking about Reyes, the kid from Fallujah, who had gone home with one good knee and a purple heart, and who Hector had tracked down 2 years ago and found was doing all right. Working at a hardware store in Albuquerque, married, had a daughter. He'd been thinking about the VA counselor who had suggested Atlas, a woman who ran a veteran support program out of a borrowed church basement in Harrodsburg, because there wasn't enough funding for proper facilities. He'd been thinking about the guys he knew, guys he'd served with and guys he'd met later, who had come home to situations that didn't hold, who'd needed something solid under their feet and hadn't found it. 40 acres was a lot of space. The cabin could be renovated. The barn was sturdy. The second structure, which turned out to be a smokehouse, just as he'd guessed, was small but fixable. There was a creek. There were the hills. There was room. "I have an idea about that," he said. He didn't move back to Harrodsburg. His house there he sold in the spring. And he didn't feel the complicated things about it he'd expected to feel. He'd thought he would grieve it more. It was where Loretta had lived, where the apple trees were, where they'd built something together over 35 years. But what he found, when he stood in the empty rooms for the last time, was that the house had just been a place. What he'd had with Loretta was something else, and it was still with him, and it was going to be with him in Breathitt County as well as anywhere. He called Clifford once, after the sale, not to gloat, not to argue, just to say that he was settling things up. And he hoped Clifford and Nadine were well, and he didn't mention the barn, and Clifford didn't mention the lawsuit, and they talked for about 6 minutes, and said goodbye in the way that people say goodbye, when they both know they've become strangers. He built the veteran retreat in stages. The first stage was the cabin renovation, proper insulation, new wiring done to code, a heating system that worked. He did a lot of the work himself. The rest he hired local contractors, and he paid them fairly. And he bought his lumber from the same hardware store in Jackson that Teddy had apparently used for decades, based on the old receipts he found in one of the tin boxes. By the following summer, the first group came up, 4 veterans, referred through the VA counselor in Harrodsburg, and a similar program out of Lexington. They stayed for a week. They worked the land. Not as therapy, Hector told them, not as a program, just because the land needed working and it felt good to do useful things with your hands. They fished the creek. They sat on the porch in the evenings and talked or didn't talk, and both were fine. Atlas moved between them all week like a quiet, steady current, settling next to whoever seemed to need it most. On the last evening, one of the men, a younger guy, maybe 32, who hadn't said much all week, sat next to Hector on the steps and looked out at the darkening hills and said, "How'd you end up out here?" "Long story," Hector said. "Good one." Hector thought about Teddy, who had come to Loretta's funeral in his 80s and driven. However far he'd driven and stood next to Hector in silence. because silence was sometimes what you had. He thought about the letter on the shelf between two old books. He thought about Atlas sniffing at a baseboard in a back bedroom with the focused patience of a creature who understood that some things took time to find. "Yeah," he said, "I think it's a good one." Atlas came and leaned against his leg, and the hills held the last of the light a little longer before finally letting it go.